Been growing tomatoes for over 20 years, and a few years after I started breeding because I got interested in seed saving. I live in the most expensive agricultural land in the United States, so I don't own anything there. I've usually leased land in neighboring Solano County. That's how I've done it for over 20 years, 20 to 30 miles each way. Always been a challenge being a distance farmer, but somehow pulled it off. Just over 20 years ago, I started working Saturdays for a friend at farmers markets. They were popping up all over the place. Could use the extra money, kind of like Country Mouse gets to go to the city. And I did these farmers markets, and he threw all these things in my truck, and I'm like, well, what are these? What am I selling? And he's like, those are tomatoes. I'm like, no, they're not. There's not a round red one in the box. You know what's going on? And that's when I found out about heirlooms. They were just kind of resurfacing, so to speak, at the time. I went to the farmers market on Saturday, and I was surrounded by beautiful women, and my pockets filled full of money, and everybody said, thank you, this is awesome, keep growing tomatoes. And I went, wow, this is me, I'm gonna be a tomato farmer. These people actually say thanks and everything. So I set out the next year, and I was gonna be a big shot and plant 500 tomato plants, which isn't a lot when you're market farming or whatever. So I trialed and errored with that. The deer, the gophers ate most of them. The next year, I actually got a little more serious about it. I grew a couple thousand plants. I had some people that I knew that sent me some seeds. I actually ended up with about 200 varieties of heirlooms I'd already learned from the farmer's market. You want to be the guy there where the people come crawling back on their knees begging for more. And I was looking for these tomatoes. I grew about 200 varieties of heirlooms, and I found out that really about 80–90% of them weren't what I wanted to grow for my customers, not what my customers wanted. They're mediocre flavor, odd shapes and sizes, they weren't convenient, issues with production and stuff in a lot of varieties. And then I started learning at the same time, these heirloom tomatoes are weird. You can save your own seeds from them. My generation, I'm gonna be 50 in a couple months. Most of us grew up in the hybrid, not to mention the high fructose corn syrup GMO generation, but we grew up in the hybrid generation where they take two varieties, cross it, it produces that fruit for 1 year, and then it changes. And most of the hybrid generation, it's still focused so much on production and looks and appearance, because let's face it, most Americans shop with their eyes. You know, they go through there and they want the biggest, shiniest, indestructible, inedible tomato that they can find for some reason. So I started saving seeds from these tomatoes, and I was growing thousands of plants by now, and about 5% maybe of the time you might get an insect cross, a natural cross that occurs. Tomato plants usually self-pollinate actually, so the flower pollinates itself. These are actually just petals, they attract insects. This is, hopefully I'm getting it right, the stamen, the pollen producer. Inside there's a little trumpet, stigma style, the thing that the pollen goes down the chute. Inside here's a little green tomato, actually the ovary. So this is a tomato flower right when it's about to pollinate. So the pollen's right here, the pollen receptor's right inside there. So the wind blows a little, that's how tomatoes self-pollinate. Once in a while, you can get an exverted stigma. It'll stick out here. It's typically on your first flower clusters of the year. You might have a bee, which honeybees, I've never seen them go to tomato flowers, but bumblebees and our little native bees sometimes will. And if Mr. Bee goes over here and gets pollen on him, and then he goes over here to this unpollinated flower and it has an exverted stigma, he might actually cross that tomato. So somehow, I call it the gift and the curse from nature. I saved some seeds from the cross, and they came out better than any of the 200 varieties of tomatoes I'd grown. So this was an amazing gift. At the same time, I didn't know it was gonna be a 20-year tomato trenches curse at the same time. So I started saving seeds from these varieties, and they were coming out better looking, better flavor. I didn't have the competition at the farmer's market. I could select through. I'd have chefs come out in my garden and help me do a lot of the selecting and stuff. So that's what started it all. And I would have definitely thrown in the towel 15 years ago or more just to common sense, say, get out of the tomato world. But I was still holding, at times, I was the only person in the whole world holding pink Berkeley tie-dye in my hand. And I'm like, you know, the tomato world can't be without this one. And that's really one of the greatest things right now, is that when people from all over the US, all over the state, all over the world say, you know, I grew this, I grew that, and it's amazing. And that's like, it finally came full circle. So anybody in here that's grown my varieties, clap 3 times for me. Awesome. Sweet. So, okay, let's start. Here's my son. He helps me for about 5 minutes a year. That's my youngest son, but there we are in the greenhouse. Here's how I field plant. So there's a lot of different ways to grow. Some people in containers, raised bed. I was doing thousands of plants. I basically plant long rows of them. So people talk about depth of planting. I like to plant 20 or 30% of the tomato plant, no matter if it's 2 inches tall or 2 feet tall. That's just my general rule of thumb. You can bury them deeper, you can bury them shallower, but by burying about 2/3 of the, or about 20, 30% of the plant, you get new roots that develop. The little tiny, you got a little piece of soil this big on your little tiny plant, that's gonna dry out. So by having it underneath the ground, that doesn't allow it to dry out very much. You get a sturdier plant and you get new root development. I typically let them go about 3 weeks, and now you can see I've stripped everything about the first 4 to 6 leaves and suckers off. Anytime you're gonna stake, cage your plant, you wanna do this. What happens is if I had let this go, it would come out and it'd grow to about here, and it'd be 20, 30 branches, and the branches of the 20, 30 branches are about to branch, and now you're growing a tumbleweed instead of a cypress tree. And you can't find your tomatoes in there, and you got a lot of little branches, so you get a lot of smaller sized fruit. So I bury about a third of the plant, let it grow approximately 3 weeks, because that's when it takes sometimes a couple weeks for the little suckers to grow out. So the plant is made up of stem, leaves, and out of the crotch of each stem and leaf, right here, right here, right here, grows a sucker, and that will continue to, it actually makes up the plant. It'll go and branch and branch. So I clean the first 4 to 6. You can pick the leaf or you can leave it. It's not going anywhere. It's a little growth that comes out of the crotch of the stem and the leaf. So I've trimmed all these down, and for me, from then on, I don't generally do any more pruning. Exception is I use about 5-foot stakes, and if the plant goes more than a foot over your support, your cage, your stake, whatever it is, it's better to try to support it or cut some of the branches, because what I've seen happen is they grow up over the top of the cage, they get tomatoes up here, and they'll flop, and your plant can actually get cooked in almost 1 day's time. So the other time when I do prune, if I got what I call a bunch of Medusa heads growing up over the top of the stake or the top of the cage, I'll prune about 20% of the branches about every 2 or 3 days. So go in there, clip one, clip one, clip one, wait a couple days, clip, clip, clip. If you were to clip the whole thing and the sun shines where the sun never shined before, that's gonna cause damage. So also, don't be afraid. Some people, am I allowed to prune? And they're like, you know, I planted a sun gold and it's only me and I can't eat 6,000 tomatoes, or, you know, a cherry tomato plant, whatever. So don't be afraid to trim them even to 2, 3, 4 laterals. Pinch all the suckers off except just 2 or 3, maybe 4, depending on how big you want to get your plant. Then you can have a modest size cherry tomato plant. And another technique that I've done is you can plant tomatoes every foot apart. I've even done 4 in 1 container and prune all the suckers off of them and let them grow up into single lateral. Basically, you're leaving stem, leaves, and then the little flower clusters that come off. You'd pick the crotch, every one, you'd pick every sucker. And you actually, that's how they do a greenhouse. Professional greenhouse, it's just single lateral. They're actually just leaving the stem, the leaves, and the flower clusters on there, and you can stack them a foot apart. You could put 4 or 5 plants in something the size of a wine barrel, so it's a great way to get where you could plant 1 variety, now you can actually plant 4, because a lot of times the game is how many varieties can I grow, but I only have so much space.